All right, so hello everyone. My name is Kiana Walton and I am with the Maryland Insurance Administration. Welcome to today's Lunch with Mia. Do you know your flood risk? Today's topic is extremely important because flooding is the most common natural disaster within the United States. No property is safe from devastation of a flood, and just 1 inch of water can cause 20,000 or more in damages to your property. So to help us learn more about flooding, understanding your flood maps, and how to reduce your flood risk, our speaker today is Kevin Wagner from the Maryland Department of Environment. So before we hear from Kevin, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping rules. Please leave phones and computers on mute for this event. If you have questions for today's speaker, please use the chat box and we will save the questions towards the end. So without further ado, I would like to have our speaker, Kevin Wagner from the Department of Environment. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Kiana. And Victoria, I think, is going to be sharing the slides for me. Great. So good afternoon. Almost said good morning, but I guess we just did cross the top of the hour. But good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. So if you can put that maybe into presenter mode. There we go. Thank you very much. So yeah, we're going to have some lunch with Mia today. You know, she's a pretty popular person, I hear, this week. Did some great presentations earlier about snow preparation from our colleagues at MDEM. So I'm going to kind of continue that, and we're going to really focus a little bit more on flooding and maybe define that in the beginning. Next slide, please. I guess before I get there, but again, my name is Kevin Wagner with Maryland Department of the Environment. If you remember anything at all from this presentation, it's just my email address. So I put that in the chat for you. I'm available as a resource to try to help answer any kind of questions you have that are flood related. I don't have all the answers, but chances are somebody else has asked a question and I might be able to direct you to a resource. I'm always glad to help. But let's go over what are some common causes of flooding. And this is probably nothing new to any of you on this call, on this webinar this afternoon, but just a variety of ways that water gets there, whether it's stormwater runoff, or also called pluvial flooding. But we're hearing this term urban flooding a lot associated with that. High tides, coastal storm events, hurricanes, nor'easters, king tides, nuisance flooding is another common one we hear about. Sea level rise, land subsidence, climate change, all these kinds of issues are leading to flooding, and we're trying to find ways to deal with it. And then, of course, riverine or flash floodings, where we get these great amounts of precipitation that happen in a relatively short duration. Of course, we've heard many times about the Ellicott City event, but those types of events are happening all over our state. And how do we deal with those kinds of things? But there's other types of flooding, and people don't really care how the water got there. Once it's in their house, how do I deal with it? So things like water main breaks and sewer backups are also issues. Next slide, please. So for urban flooding, and this is actually a picture of Baltimore City, you can see here a gentleman sitting on top of his car, and this area is not mapped in a high-risk flood hazard area, but certainly there's some drainage issues going on, and the water backs up, and you know, try to avoid driving into these areas if at all possible. But just a common cause here in Maryland, these urban flooding issues. Next slide. And then nuisance flooding is more on the tidal side of things. At least that's how we've been approaching it in the state. And you can see the definition here is any high tide flooding that causes a public inconvenience. So there are a lot of nuisance flooding events happening out there in the city of Baltimore, as well as Annapolis and other areas. Next slide. Water main breaks do happen. And in the city, you know, if it crosses two different property boundaries, that could be something that's a covered loss if you have flood insurance. So it's not like a traditional type of flood that we would normally think of, but it has happened. Next slide. So today, what I really want to focus on is trying to educate you a little bit more about knowing your risk and what sources of information are out there. So I'm going to focus a bit on the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has flood insurance rate maps, But I'm also going to kind of give you a little tickler of other sources of information that you might want to take a look at. And then I'll try to quickly go through some ways that you can reduce your risk after you kind of figure out that you have certain home or property or businesses that are at risk to flooding. What could you do to maybe reduce that risk? Next slide. So a lot of this is premised about the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's basically what I do. I help to coordinate that throughout the state of Maryland, along with my supervisor, Dave Gannett. Dave is more on the mapping side of things, and I interact with local governments, property owners, engineers, architects, surveyors, you name it. I probably work with them. But the NFIP is a program that was set up nationally. It started in 1968, and it's really this coordination, this partnership between the federal government and the community, which is basically any kind of county or municipal government. So insurance is kind of the basis for it, but it has tentacles in a lot of other things related to disaster assistance and loans and things like that. Next slide. So there's like 3 key components or compartments of the NFIP, the maps and data, what we're going to really focus on, but I'm also going to touch on the management side, include regulations and mitigation actions that you can take to protect yourself. But there is this third piece about flood insurance that I'm not really going to touch on today, but certainly our partners with Maryland Insurance Administration have put together information. There's resources on their website. Of course, you can go to FEMA's website, floodsmart.gov. But today we're going to kind of do the maps and related management information. Next slide. So what tools do we have on the FEMA side about knowing our risk? So the common one are the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. These are developed as a countywide product usually, but the municipalities are part of that effort. But they issue panels that are broken into an index. However, all this information is geographically enabled. So there are mapping systems that you can easily access this. You don't need to deal with these clunky paper panels that you used to have to. But that's really the foundation of what we use for floodplain management and insurance rating purposes. But things may and will be changing in the future related to that with Risk Rating 2.0, which is a whole separate topic in itself. But there could be community identified flood risk. Do you have high water marks in the area? Are there sea level rise projections for 2050 or 2100? So any kinds of things could be used to know your risk. And I'm going to touch on a couple other tools here later. Next. So let's talk about the flood insurance rate map, what it does and what it doesn't do. So this is a really confusing term when you talk about recurrence intervals and that sort of thing, the 1% annual chance flood. But all this is really saying is that a flood of this predicted magnitude will occur. It has a 1 in 100 chance of occurrence in any given year. So, we could have the big event tomorrow, and the next day we could have another event of equal magnitude. So just understand that these maps have certain limitations. They're based on certain assumptions and predictions. And, floods don't follow map boundaries. It certainly can and will flood outside of the FEMA designated areas. But this is the national standard that we use for floodplain management purposes. We are starting to go beyond that a little bit more. There is this 0.2% annual chance flood, which we refer to as the 500-year flood. The 1% is referred to as the 100-year flood oftentimes. But some communities are starting to do floodplain management in that 0.2% or 500-year floods areas. Next slide. So common terms, and I'm going to try not to use too many terms or acronyms, but it's hard to get away from that in FEMA land. But the base flood elevation is essentially the depth of that 1% annual chance flood or that 100-year flood. The special flood hazard area is the horizontal extent of where that flood will go. Next slide. So on the maps, there are different risk zones, and we try to, FEMA tries to highlight them based on what level of risk they are. Are they a low risk, a moderate risk, or a high risk? Notice that we did not say no risk. So just because it is not in a FEMA map zone doesn't mean there isn't any kind of a flood risk. It's just, these are the areas where these mandatory purchase requirements for flood insurance come into play, as well as regulatory requirements. Next slide. So focusing on the high risk areas, I just wanted to quickly give you some examples of these different zones, what all these letters mean. But an A zone, essentially in a riverine or non-tidal area, this is pretty traditional. This is in Cecil County. It's just a blue blob, and traditionally it does not have a base flood elevation. Now, I'll caveat to say that since we're a mapping partner and we've had an active role in updating these maps, we have information behind the scenes. So if you get into a situation where you're in an A zone or you're dealing with an A zone and you need an elevation, we may have that for you, and chances are you could probably access that on our outreach website, mdfloodmaps.net, which I'll also show you in a bit. Next slide. And here's a standard AE zone. This should look familiar to you. This downtown area in Annapolis, Ego Alley. So again, the blue shaded area is a high risk flood hazard area, the 1% annual chance flood event, or the 100-year flood. And then those orange areas on the fringes are the 500-year or 0.2% chance floodplain. And again, regulatory requirements, insurance issues tend to kick in only in those blue shaded areas, but we need to pay attention to the areas just outside. Next slide. Now for riverine areas of an AE zone, and this is in Ellicott City along Main Street, additional information will start to pop up. There'll be squiggly lines going across to give you the elevations. These are general elevations that are used for flood insurance rating purposes. Our local government officials, when they're doing permit review, they're going to look at other information like a flood insurance study to get more data to give you a more precise base flood elevation, so we know exactly how high to set those first floor heights and all that kind of stuff. Next slide. And here's an example of an AE zone in a riverine area out in Western Maryland. The hatched area is what we call a floodway, and this is where the velocity of the water tends to move faster. It's still a high risk flood hazard area. It's still a 100-year floodplain. But we try to limit development in the floodway because things are moving through pretty quickly, and usually the water's a lot deeper. Next slide. And then I think this is one of the last ones with the VE zone. This is a coastal high hazard area, and the blue areas again are the high risk, and then the orange are the 500-year or moderate risk. And you can see along the ocean front here in Ocean City, I think I picked an example near the Princess Royale. And that line stops on the landward toe of the sand dune. So if you've been to Ocean City, you know there's a big sand dune there. So as part of that mapping process and how FEMA does its mapping, you know, that regulatory line ends at the landward toe of the dune in most cases. Next slide. So coastal areas are really important. Something else I wanted to point out was this thing called a limit of moderate wave action. So with V zones, you get wave heights that can go up to 3 feet, you know, but that wave energy just doesn't stop at the shoreline. It can dissipate, it goes in and has a transitional area. So we go from a VE zone to an AE zone in some cases, not all cases, but we want to know where those wave heights are still at 1.5 feet. So FEMA started putting a line on the map called a LiMWA. Next slide. And here's an example of this line in Charles County area in Benedict. And in most cases, it's along the shoreline, but it just depends on the topography, how that wave interacts with the shoreline. But why I bring this up is if you are planning a new project and your home or business is seaward of that black line with the flags that you see there, you may be required to do some certain things as far as elevation, the types of foundation that you use, but it's just something that we use as a tool on the floodplain management side. Next slide. So where can I get all this information? We have a great resource, mdfloodmaps.net. You bring up that main page. Over on the right, you're going to see a link for a flood risk application that you can click on, where you can enter your address and turn on and off layers and do all these great things. So this is just a great tool that will help you quickly figure out if you're in or out of that FEMA floodplain. Next slide. And if you get really good with it, you can actually produce one of these flood risk maps. You can place a pin on the map and then produce a PDF that you could then, share with your lender, your agent, or whoever you're working with, or just keep it for your own personal awareness. Next slide. FEMA also has a great resource, the Flood Map Service Center, and they've done a tremendous job over the last several years in adding a lot of information in here. So again, you can go through their site, also type in your address and get similar results. But there is a ton of information in there. So I'm not going to go into all of the products that are available there, but depending upon what you're looking for, if it's a current map or an older map, chances are you can get it on this site. Next slide. And similarly, you can create these little, they call them FIRMettes, which is a portion of the flood insurance rate map, but it just gives you a snippet of the index panel, the map scale, the north arrow, and then you can download that as a PDF or PNG file or whatever you want to do, or print it. Next slide. And they have this really neat thing, similarly like the flood risk application that we have in Maryland. They have the National Flood Hazard Layer. I know all these acronyms are getting crazy, right? But anyway, same thing. You can interact with their web map interface and type in your address and download a map. Next slide. So let's talk for a couple minutes about other sources of flood risk data. Okay, so we've been focusing a lot on the FEMA products, what kind of the limitations of those products are, but what about beyond the FEMA floodplain boundary? So I wanted to quickly highlight two of them, one of which is we've been doing a lot of work on in Maryland, this CoSmart Climate Ready Action Boundary. Hey, we're Marylanders, we love crabs, right? So we had to come up with an acronym that had the word CRAB in it, but that's what that CRAB stands for, Climate Ready Action Boundary. And then the other one is called Flood Factor that you may have heard about or seen, and it's used by real estate listing websites like realtor.com and some others. But that's one that is starting to map risk beyond the FEMA floodplain. Next slide. So the CRAB, what we're doing is we're taking that FEMA data as a foundation, and then we're adding 3 feet to it, but we're not just stopping there. We're also extending that line out horizontally to see where it would land on the ground. And this is important because in my world, in floodplain management world, if you're in the FEMA floodplain and we have a new house going in, we would say, okay, well, the base flood elevation is 100. The community has some higher standards and they add 2 more feet of elevation. So you have to build to 102. And then, okay, we'd set the floor height at 102 and everything's great. Well, the problem is you could have a house on the other side of the FEMA line that could be brand new. And of course, you got to follow all other applicable codes and ordinances. But from a floodplain management perspective, you wouldn't have to elevate. And to us, that does not make any sense. It does not set us up for being resilient, knowing that things are changing out there. So we came up with this tool, the CRAB, that will help illustrate where this inundation area will go and gives you varying depths of coverage there. So I'll show you that in a second. Next slide. So this particular example, and this comes from a story map that the Maryland Environmental Service helped put together for us. So in Arundel here, you can see the blue area is the typical FEMA floodplain. And we hatched it, even though we talked about floodway earlier and that being the floodway, this isn't a floodway. They just hatched it in areas that were over land just so it didn't wash out. But you can kind of get a sense for what's impacted in this particular community. Next slide. And then as we add the CRAB, we add the inundation level. So the purple is where the depths are greater than 2 feet. Green is where it's 1 to 2 feet. And then yellow is less than a foot. So, hey, if you're doing a house that's, not in a FEMA zone, but you kind of want to know that, hey, if things did rise, if things go beyond the FEMA mapping, what should I be prepared for? This gives you a little bit more information about maybe I do want to add 1 more foot to my house, or maybe I want to, elevate my electrical, mechanical equipment or whatever. Next slide. So when you click on the map, you can get, comparisons of what the actual ground elevations are and that sort of thing. We're not going to get into all that today, but but this just kind of paints the picture for you what the depth of flooding could be on the ground surface. Next slide. And you can add building footprints to really get a good sense of what buildings are impacted, what the depths of flooding could be at those buildings, et cetera. Next slide. So the other source I wanted to mention to you real quick is Flood Factor. And Flood Factor is put together by this nonprofit called the First Street Foundation. And they're looking at flooding and projections much greater than what FEMA does. So we're looking into the future. Unlike FEMA is kind of the current and historic. Well, I shouldn't say current. It's current as when the maps are created per FEMA, but basically historic data. And then Flood Factor is kind of making future projections of based on increased precipitation, based on what we're hearing, what could the area look like? So once they do their data analysis, they come up with this scoring matrix from a 1 to 10 to give you a sense of how high of a flood risk it is. Next slide. So again, like I said earlier, realtor.com is really started to use this information. So when you type in an address, and it really doesn't even have to be listed, you can pull up the address, and when you click on the map, you can turn on this flood data. And I don't know if I actually put the map on here. I should have, but it'll actually show you the depth of flooding, and you could also compare it to the FEMA zones to see what information was presented there. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to move and shift a little bit quickly into the floodplain management and regulation side of this, because this is an important part. So we kind of know these tools out there, but what do we have at our disposal? So all local governments that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program have to adopt certain standards, building codes, and ordinances. And it's part of that burdensome process that you may have had to go through to get a permit, but there's a method to it. There's a reasoning behind it, and we're really trying to keep property and life, more importantly, safe and just protect from damage. Next slide. One of the things that communities often do is add this thing called Freeboard, and it's a factor of safety. We talked about the base flood elevation, which is kind of that minimum 1% annual chance flood that's shown on the FEMA maps, but a lot of communities are now adding 1, 2, or even 3 feet of freeboard to go beyond that. So if a permit comes in, they're going to elevate even higher. So there's a lot of great reasons for doing that. And most importantly, on the insurance side, it can really save in a relatively short amount of time. So even though it may cost you some additional money on the front end, it can really save you in relatively short duration on your premiums in the long term. Next slide. And here's an example of an elevation project in Crisfield, or at least one home elevation. So it looks pretty standard. Next slide. And then here's an example in Calvert County. This is a velocity zone, a coastal area. So the foundation has to be open to allow the water to go through. Next slide. So another tool that might help you evaluate your risk, at least based on the FEMA mapping, is this thing called an elevation certificate. And you may be aware of it, you may not, but this tool could be used to help evaluate what your elevations are around your house, what your lowest floor elevation is, what the elevation of machinery and equipment are, and then comparing that to the FEMA elevation to give you a sense of what is exactly at risk. And maybe that will help point you in the direction of what kind of mitigation things you could do. There is a cost associated with this usually. They range. I don't want to provide a fee because that would be a disservice to the surveyors that do that. But it just depends on your area. It depends on how difficult of an elevation certificate it is, how far they have to bring control in to set that elevation and all that kind of stuff. But in Maryland, only a licensed land surveyor can certify as-built information. So work with the Maryland Society of Surveyor, go to their website, and you can find a surveyor through there. Next slide. So here's where we're just going to quickly step through some mitigation actions, things that you can do. They may sound pretty self-explanatory, maybe pretty obvious, but I'm going to go through each one of these quickly. But you see this acronym at the end, FRED, and that stands for floodproof, relocate, elevate, and demolish. So these are different mitigation techniques on the structural side that can be done. Sometimes this might be a little costly, and there might be some grant resources that I can point you in the direction to. But one of your great mitigation tools that you have, that everybody has in our state, you can purchase flood insurance either through the NFIP or through a private insurer. Sometimes that might be another option. Next slide. So flood damage resistant materials, what does that mean? That means don't use drywall, don't use fiberglass insulation. Use things that if they get wet, you don't have to tear it out and throw it away or put it to the curb. Things like cement board, brick and tile, marine grade plywood, sprayed polyurethane foam insulation. These things, if they get wet, usually all you have to do is hose it off and you're good to go. The green board, which you might see in bathrooms and things like that, that is not really designed to be submerged underwater for a length of time. That's just for, some damp conditions, but certainly not designed to be submerged, nor is strand board, the oriented strand board or fiberglass insulation, of course, carpeting as well. Next slide. Flood openings are critically important. So if you have a home that's elevated on a crawl space foundation or block, concrete, whatever, if you're in a flood risk area, you want to have these flood openings in there to reduce the pressure that is exerted on the wall. So there's a variety of ways that you could meet the requirement. It doesn't have to be an actual engineered flood opening. It could be bricks turned on the side. It could be lattice work, but there are certain prescriptive requirements that are needed depending on the size of your structure. But these things typically have to be within 12 inches of grade. They typically need to be in at least 2 different walls in order for you to get credit. Next slide. So this just shows some illustrations of the water coming up on the wall. And on the right side, we're trying to balance that water pressure so that you don't have too much pressure on one side. And this was very, very problematic during Isabel in 2003, a lot of foundation damage, and we still continue to see it. When the ground gets saturated, when the water pressure exerts on the wall, it can lead to failure. So if you're in a high-risk area, this might be a consideration for you, and it can also help reduce flood insurance costs. Next. Backflow prevention valves. So if water's coming up, how can we prevent water from backflowing into our system? So these valves can do just that, so that it doesn't come up through your drains, doesn't come up through the toilets and sinks and things like that. Next slide. Elevating your HVAC units. You see these platforms all the time. I did want to point out that elevating them is great, but we also want them to be anchored because there are wind considerations as well. But this particular example in Dorchester County shows you the flood openings as well as an elevated HVAC unit. Next slide. And if you have a garage area or a basement even, and water's getting in there, there are ways that you can elevate your utilities. So if you can't elevate it on a block foundation, kind of like what's illustrated on the left, there might be other ways that you can do it. As in the next slide here, you could actually build a barrier around these areas and seal it off. And you want to make sure that any doors or entry points are sealed with gaskets to prevent water from getting in there. But there are different ways that you could do this, even if you could not elevate these systems. Next slide. Fuel tanks. We have a lot of these all over the state, and they vary from oil tanks to propane tanks, but it's really important that these be anchored to some kind of a solid foundation. Sometimes you could do that with concrete, through rebar reinforcement, but other times, next slide, you want to put straps over these things to anchor them down. So there are ways that you can, if this is outside, that you can use a ground anchoring system. Next slide. Here's an example of the Eastern Shore, some propane tanks of strapping systems. So usually whatever supplier you're using, they should be very familiar with this. So sometimes if they're not aware that you're in a vulnerable area, or maybe you want to be extra careful and just have them do it anyway, reach out to them and ask them if they can do this for you. Chances are they're well aware of these strapping, but it would be on top of a traditional service. So you would have to ask for that. Next slide. And this is just an oil tank example. The other thing with oil tanks is they have a vent pipe, and you want to make sure those vent pipes are extended because you don't want the water to get in there. And then you also want it to be sealed so that the water doesn't contaminate all the heating oil, which is very expensive these days. So there are special, gaskets and valve covers that you can use. Next slide. And let's not forget about the sheds in our backyard. These things can float. I've got lots of pictures of them. I should have put some pictures in there. But we need to anchor them. We also need to have flood openings to balance the pressure in them as well, and elevate any kind of utilities. A lot of people are using these for shops and other things, but elevate those utilities and mechanical systems. Next slide. And that's just a picture from Harford County. They do have flood openings on the side on this particular one. Next slide. So how are you going to pay for that? Remember we talked about that guy, Fred, flood-proof, relocate, elevate, and demolish. These usually have a substantial cost to them. So there are various grants out there that you can Google these things. Some are through FEMA. Our partners at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management coordinate these grants. But in Maryland, we also have a comprehensive flood management grant program. And actually that solicitation opened yesterday. So we'll be sending that out to our communities, but usually local governments have to sponsor these projects, sometimes nonprofits, but usually it has to go through a local government. So it's not really individual property owners. Next slide. And I thought this was a cool one. This is a church that was being elevated through FEMA grant funds on Hooper's Island. So this is during the process, and very common, they'll elevate it on these steel beams, I-beams, and then put the cribbing beneath it. And then next slide. So that was in 2012, they were doing it. And then I was down there about a year or so ago, drove by, and here's the finished product. So it really ties in nicely. You would have never known that they did anything. They had the flood openings, as you can see, it's elevated. They put the ramping system in there for ADA access. So we can do these things, we can adapt. Next slide. Some great publications, not going to get into all of them, but one I really wanted to point out is to protect your home from flooding, low-cost projects you can do yourself. Next slide. And I'm going to put the link in there for you because I do have that. You can access that. But this thing does a great job of telling you things you can do outside your home, inside your home, and sometimes there's no cost to some of the things you could do initially, cleaning your gutters, making sure your drainage ditches and the inlets are clear, or calling your respective Department of Public Works to help you with that. Maybe elevating your washer and dryer that's in the basement on a block, a couple blocks or whatever, pallets I've even seen. So there are things that you can do that don't cost any money. And then there are some things that might cost a little bit more, if you want to do backflow prevention or flood openings or things like that. But one of the really simple things in that low cost to no cost category is putting things on a shelf. So if you have things in the basement, get some shelving. Maybe it can be something real cheap, or you can go to Home Depot and buy some, but start putting things on shelves, putting it in bins and protecting it. And it also has a section in here on flood preparedness, really some great tips. Next slide. And one I really like on the preparedness side is FEMA has this application, the FEMA mobile app, which is really great. I mean, they put a lot of thought and process into this. I can get weather alerts. You can pick up the 5 geographic areas throughout the state where it'll give you actual watches and warnings and alerts. There's a lot of resources in here about mitigation. It gives you some tips about like sump pump maintenance and all kinds of great things. But in the emergency management world, they say make a plan, build a kit, stay informed. This is a great way to take that initial step. Reach out to your community. They might have like a reverse 911 system or some kind of a system that you can sign up for to receive these alerts. But connect with your neighbors, work together, exchange numbers. It's amazing of what we can do initially if we lean on each other to kind of, support one another. And somebody recently said this great line, you are the help until help arrives. So, working with your neighbors can really help you with that. Next slide. Websites, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of them, but these are just the ones I alluded to. We're not going to get into all that, but our department, of course, has multiple links and websites as well as FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide. So that's all I have. I guess at this point, we will take it, open it up for questions. There is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me though.
Thank you, Kevin. A lot of great information. Thank you. So right now we're going to take questions. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box.
Okay, let's see. Scott S. is asking, preliminary flood zones, are those always adopted, or is there a chance they may change? For example, if a property's preliminary flood zone is better, can I expect flood insurance rates to decrease? That's a great question, Scott, and it kind of depends. So it sounds like you might be in a community where the FEMA maps are changing, and right now they issued a preliminary product or a draft map, and it sounds like that change might be positive for you, which is great. Sometimes it's the reverse, and people aren't too happy, but sometimes you can use that preliminary information to, address insurance increases or lower your insurance right now, especially if you're in that A zone. Remember, we talked about the A zone where there's no base flood elevation. So if you're in a zone A, that could be something that could help you right off the bat. But otherwise, if you're in an AE zone, sometimes you have to wait for these products to become effective, which could take a little bit of time. But having said all that, FEMA is changing the way they're doing rating. They are no longer really going to be relying heavily on the FEMA maps to do insurance rating. They're going to be moving to this risk rating 2.0 process where they're going to use things like distance from the coast, type of construction, replacement cost value, the elevation of your home or structure, your elevation of mechanical, electrical. Do you have flood openings? So there's going to be things that are going to go well beyond just the FEMA mapping. And the whole point behind it is to try to create a more equitable and fair pricing methodology so that everybody, is paying their fair share. We don't have, two homes that are side by side, $1 million home and a $200,000 home that have the same premium. Okay, what's the next question we have here? Is there any grants for native plants and improvements you can make to your yard around the house to mitigate flooding before it reaches the house? Tim, I love that question. So this is awesome because we're all part of like a watershed. And if we each take some individual action, like creating rain gardens, decreasing impervious surfaces and things like that, we can help manage our watershed and reduce the runoff. So as far as the grants go, I would have to defer back to like the local public works folks and those that are in watershed management and the environmental planning groups. But many times there are grants through folks like the Chesapeake Bay Trust, I think is one. I don't know if it requires like a local government sponsor, but sometimes they are coordinated and they do work directly with property owners. So that's probably just one example. So if anybody can think of others while it comes up, go ahead and put that in the chat so we can help each other out with that. Any other questions that I missed?
No, it doesn't look like there's any more questions.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to all of you at the Maryland Insurance Administration, and of course, all of you that took the time out to listen today. I'll hang on and we'll see if any other questions come up, but thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate the information and you taking time today to speak to everyone. I see something coming in the chat. Okay, so everyone's just saying thank you and how great your presentation was.
Yeah, thank you.
So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will have our final event, virtual event on Tuesday, December 14th at 12 p.m. And the topic should be, will be, what you should know before you hire someone to repair your home. So you can register on Eventbrite, or you can get on our website for more information. I have put in the chat information for our event survey. This is a great way for us to get feedback on the quality and the content of the event. So if everyone could please take time to fill that out, it would be very helpful. And if there is no more questions, we will end today's presentation. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Kiana. And I did put the link to the grant program that I mentioned that opened yesterday through our department. It's the Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program. If you're a local government official, our department blasts out all of our loans and grant programs, you know, whether it's revolving loan funds or other things. So it came out in that solicitation, and this is just one more tool that we have.
Yes, and this recording will also be available on our website. So if you'd like to share this with others, that would be great. Thank you.